All right, it's noon. So I think I will get things started. Happy GIS Day, everybody. This is BJ Covington. I am the chair of the Iowa Geographic Information Council this year. I'd like to welcome you to our inaugural Lunch and Learn. Today I'm having soup. We've got a great presentation from Gail Shea, who comes to us from Sealer Instruments, discussing professional GPS mapping, what you need to know about achieving high accuracy XY locations in the field. And as a person who doesn't do a whole lot of field work, I'm pretty excited to hear what Gail has to say. So, Gail, go ahead and take her away.
Okay, thanks. Can everybody hear me?
I can.
Yes, you're good.
Okay. That looks like what I want. And is my audio still there?
Yeah, you're good.
Great. Does my mouse show as well, or just, is there a way to, I know how to do it in Zoom. Is there a way to have a laser pointer on the screen?
The mouse works. I can see it.
So you can see it? Okay, that's good, because that sometimes helps. So, okay. Yep. Well, thanks for the intro. Thanks for inviting me. BJ, I'll try to do my best to have you know more about this by the time I'm done. And I'm not sure I'll fill the whole hour, but that's okay. And feel free to ask questions as you go along. And as far as who I am and who Seiler is, some of you probably already know me because I've worked with quite a few of you. Seiler is your local Trimble dealer. We're a company that's headquartered here in the Midwest, and it's actually our 75th anniversary, family-owned company. And we've been dealing with Trimble equipment ever since it became on the commercial market. And we can help you with any geospatial questions you might have across lots of sectors. I'm just representing the mapping GIS product line when I do my job. And today's not a sales job. It's really the education stuff. So, but that's who I am and why I am a GISP. And so that's my qualifications to give today's talk. And so GPS mapping 101. How do you want to get the high accuracy results you need from your GPS? So let's start out and talk about the pieces that GPS needs to really work if you're going to be doing getting professional results. There's 3 segments that are involved. All the stuff that's up in space, constellations of satellites, the monitoring station and correction sources that are terrestrial based and do all of the GeoGeek math behind the scenes, et cetera, that let those devices that we can carry in our hands get good results, and then the actual choice that you have to be using as a rover device when you do go out in the field to do mapping. So starting with segment 1, what's up there in space and how does it work? Is there a little pop-up that's in the way on people's screens? I've got a pop-up that I'm trying to.
I don't see anything.
Okay, then I'll ignore it. So it really is, the concept is actually pretty simple. If you remember back to high school geometry, if you know how fast something is traveling and you've got a distance, you can tell how far away it was, or you know how you've got a distance and you know how far away you need to travel. You can choose a speed to get there in a certain time, etc. GPS is really working on that simple geometry. A distance is a runtime times a velocity. We'll come back to this, but remember this 300,000 meters per second. That's the velocity of electromagnetic energy like light and radio signals, and the GPS signals are traveling at that speed. We'll come back to that. So conceptually, to do the math, when you're standing somewhere on the surface of the Earth with a GPS receiver, and you can pick up any 3 satellite signals, those spheres that are a certain distance from each other that you can see in the illustration here, there's only 2 points that all 3 of those spheres would actually intersect, and only one of them is going to also intersect with the surface of the Earth. And so when you hear people say that, they sometimes use the word triangulate, that's kind of gets at the concept. Technically, it's trilateralate because you can't do it. Triangulating is in two dimensions, and we're working in 3 dimensions. But that's one of the reasons why you hear triangulate, because conceptually, with a minimum of 3, you can figure out where you are. And mathematically, in the abstract, that 4th sphere is the surface of the Earth itself. But for redundancy and for a check in the system, professional GPSs always require at least a minimum of 4 signals, because then that will eliminate the possibility that there might be a timing error, or if one of the satellites was a little off orbit, or it didn't, or its clock got off or something like that, you wouldn't know that with only 3. So to get a professional result, a professional GPS is always going to be listening to a minimum of 4 satellite signals. So let's watch this for a little bit. This is a nice GIF that shows the Earth turning. Someone's sitting somewhere in mid-America, and the satellites orbiting around. That is a representative picture of the orbits of the GPS satellites. There should be 24 of them in the picture if it were the complete constellation. And you can see, just as the Earth rotates and the satellites orbit, at any one time without moving, there's only a few satellites that are above the horizon able to actually hit the antenna of your receiver. So that's one of the reasons why, if you're using a piece of equipment that tells you how many satellites are visible, that's what's always going on above you in the sky for visibility. And you can see with about 20 satellites, you're usually at least just above the horizon is usually 6 to 8 satellites. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So that's going on. Another piece that's happening that most people might not realize is that those signals are actually being broadcast in more than one frequency. And if you ever heard people talk about GPS codes, signals, you might hear the words code and carrier, or the number, the other name also called L1 and L2. So that's, just remember that the signals are coming from the satellites in multiple frequencies. It still travels at 300,000 meters per second. They're the same speed, but they're going to have a different sine wave of the shape of that signal as it's coming towards the Earth and towards your GPS receiver. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So, since we're talking about space, how many are actually up there? Here's where a little bit of history comes in. Actually, the GPS constellation global positioning system is run by NavStar, Department of Defense military here in the United States. And it actually started to come online in the late 1980s, but the constellation was fully deployed first and ready to go in 1995. And until 2012, GPS, the US constellation of 24 satellites, was the only game in town. And if you look at the orbital tracks there, the way that those are deployed is there's 6 orbital tracks that go around the world, and each orbit has 4 satellites on it, equally spaced around it. So those 24 satellites are doing exactly what we saw in that animated picture a little bit ago. So what happened in 2012? 2012, the other countries started to join in, starting with Russia. If you see here that you got the names of the different constellations, GPS was GPS, when you use the initials GPS, it is actually technically the United States constellation of satellites. We use it synonymously to everything, but GPS is the United States. GLONASS is Russia. Galileo is run by the European Union. Beidou is run by China. Augmentation, I'll talk about a little bit later. Those are correction sources, and I'm not sure what Iridium is, but there's lots of satellites up there. Take that as the current, and I'm sure there are more being deployed. So a lot of new satellites or space vehicles have been put up in the sky and are there for us to use if we want to get professional GPS results. If you are the person holding a GPS standing at this crosshairs, and this is just a typical snapshot of somewhere in the upper Midwest, and at that moment in time at 8 a.m. on that day, there were 20 satellites in sight above the horizon, or above the setting that the GPS was set to look for. One of the things that's true is if you say it's 0 for the horizon, and there is a satellite that is that low in the sky for you, it's typically not going to give you a very good signal, because it's just like the sunset turns orange because it's going through more of the atmosphere when it's sunrise or sunset. Using signals that are really low in the horizon are usually not very high quality. So most professional GPS units only listen to satellites that are coming from at least 10 degrees above the horizon. So again, this snapshot shows it's got 20 possible satellites to listen to. Only 5 of them are actually the GPS constellation, and the other ones are coming from other countries. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important, and when I talk about the possibility for accuracy again more later. So this is a pretty typical snapshot. In the Midwest, if you step outside and are able to have a piece of equipment that listens to multi-constellation, which is called GNSS, versus GPS, you're going to see about 20 satellites. So that's what's up there beaming information down at us. And there's a whole bunch of equipment and activity that are terrestrial based that make this system work as well. And here's the reason why. So the satellites that we've been talking about are up there beaming an electromagnetic energy beam at the Earth, but for it to come through the atmosphere, there's a refraction or a dispersal that happens to the actual signal. And similar to what it looks like when you are looking visually at something in water, the visual electromagnetic light from the pencil travels at a different speed in air than it does in water, which is why the pencil looks like it's in a different place when you're looking at it through the water. The same thing happens to the GPS signal when it's coming through the atmosphere, which causes an artificial delay for how long that signal is traveling, which, if you remember back to the ultimate mathematical formula that's happening for the calculation of those distances, if this is happening, it thinks the satellite's further away than it actually is. When you have a piece of equipment that's listening to the satellite signals and they're coming through the atmosphere uncorrected, you're not doing anything to handle that distortion, that wiggle in the signal that's happening. It's called autonomous. So if you hear about autonomous GPS or uncorrected, that means it's coming through the atmosphere as is, and there hasn't been any manipulation to it. So if you want to have high accuracy, you have to take into account that process that we were just talking about of the distortion from the atmosphere. And that process is called differential corrections. So here you are, you're a GPS user, you've got a receiver on your person, and you want to figure out exactly where you are. You're roving. This is the one that doesn't know exactly where it is and wants to have somehow to get a measure of what the atmospheric distortion is. The navigational satellites are up there broadcasting their positions and their atomic time. And nearby on a terrestrial base station somewhere, there's going to be a similar or high accuracy receiver sitting on a fixed location in a surveyed point, so it knows where it is. So this receiver is very high accuracy, and it already knows where it is in geographic and spherical coordinates. So what it does is the base station receiver listens to the same satellites that and it has the same sky conditions as where the rover, the nearby rover is, and it has its known position. So just like your rover, it calculates for every epoch of the satellite signals a result that gives it an XY location, and then it compares that result that it just mathematically calculated to its known position and gets a differential. So that's where the name differential correction comes from. And so this base station listens to the satellites, calculates a position, calculates the differential from the known position, and broadcasts that. So while the satellites are going, here's where I am in the sky, the base station is going, here's the difference in my area for the correction for the distortion in the atmosphere coming from the GPS satellites. So that's happening 24/7, whether you use it or not. There are terrestrial-based base stations that are calculating differentials for GPS happening all the time. So here you are again, you're the rover and you want to use that signal. How can you get it? Well, this again, the GPS satellites are operating up in the sky above where your location is. And if the differential correction signal that's being calculated by a base station like I just described is being broadcast by a radio, you can have your roving receiver have a radio listen to a signal. So they can come from radios. They can come from an IP data cell network that's broadcasting a data stream over the internet, or some base stations pipe their differentials back up to a satellite that's not a navigational satellite. It's a correction. It's an augmentation satellite, and the one that most of you may not be aware that you've used, but is in wide use, is run here in the United States by the Federal Aviation Administration, and it was put up there in the 80s, and it was first used for when they started helping airplanes land with instrument navigation and large ships out on the maritime environment coming into port. So they started using GPS for those types of functions long before we all had a phone with a GPS on it. And so their system, the FAA runs it. They've got 3 satellites that are parked above North America, and the base stations that the FAA runs for calculating those differentials that I talked about pipes their results up to this base station that's just sitting above North America. So if your rover has a channel to listen to this satellite, it's getting a correction signal from the satellite. So just to reiterate, if you don't want to have uncorrected, autonomous, or distorted signals, you do have to have a correction signal, and you can get them from another satellite, a correction satellite, a cell network data source, which I'll talk about again in a minute, or a radio base station. People who have any experience with surveying, for a long time, surveyors all used to set up their own base station and have a little radio working over their project area, and that's what they were doing, was getting base station corrections. So if you remember back to where I talked about the signal coming in at 300,000 meters per second at the speed of light, the reason why dual frequency is important and why professional units that have the highest levels of high accuracy require dual frequency can be explained with this illustration here. If your GPS receiver is listening to just the low frequency code signal, one epoch of a GPS signal, so the broadcast frequency or the broadcast interval of the GPS signals is it takes 1/1000th of a second for them to broadcast their actual little epoch, each beep. And so at 1,000th of 1 second, the low frequency code or L1 signal can travel 300 meters. And so if your receiver's time, the rover that you have in your hand, if your receiver's time is within 1% of the exact atomic time that the satellites are working on, that 300 meters can get you about 3 meters of accuracy. So when you're listening to a low frequency, it's again, they're the same speed, but the sine wave is longer on the code signal. You can't get any better. It's physically impossible to get better than that meter, the more than a meter in size for the accuracy of an L1 device. So when you work with someone like me to get a professional sub-meter or sub-foot or sub-inch GPS unit, that device by definition is going to be a dual frequency processing piece of equipment. It's going to listen to both the low code signal and the higher carrier L2 signal. And the actual specs on the carrier is it's 1,000 times faster than or 1,000 times smaller in the sine wave of the signal. And so you just start out with everything two zeros smaller. So 1 epoch in a carrier code at 1/1000th of a second travels about 3 meters. And then if your rover is within 1% of the atomic time, so the timing accuracy is good, then you're going to be down to about 0.3 of a meter. So just out of the box, you get much higher ability to have a high accuracy result when you're using a dual frequency piece of equipment. So anybody have any questions after the space segment or the terrestrial part of it? Am I still broadcasting?
Yeah.
Okay, just didn't hear any noise at all.
You're
Okay,
just being so good, Gail, that we are totally with you.
That's good, but don't hesitate to ask a question, anybody. So that gets us down to part number 3. We've got a whole bunch of satellites beaming stuff at us in more than one frequency. We have a bunch of terrestrial base stations all around the world. And actually, let me talk about number 2 again. Most of you who've had any experience with a high accuracy piece of equipment are often using the state DOT base station networks that are called core stations. Sometimes they're called VRS, which means virtual reference station, or RTN for real-time network. And those base stations are typically put on concrete pedestals or the corners of buildings at Department of Transportation workstations. And I know in Wisconsin, there's 85, which is a little bit more than 1 per county. I'm not sure how many stations there are in the RTN in Iowa, but essentially 1 per county. Scattered across the state, the DOT has a base station doing that terrestrial monitoring stuff and calculating differentials. And those networks beam their differential data for people to use by using a cell connection to an IP mount point on a server at the DOT. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more. So we got satellites beaming signals at us, some sort of terrestrial base station getting rid of the distortion that we need to have high accuracy. And then we've got us using our gear, and we've got to have a certain level of onboard capability to be able to use those things that are coming at us from segment 1 and segment 2. I already went through the why the dual frequency is required. So why can't we map with the GPS chips in our phones or tablets? If you look at this picture, the red stuff was done with a professional piece of GPS equipment. It happened to be a Geo 7X, if anybody knows what that is, which is a Trimble device. And then the blue one was done with an iPhone. And you can see, because the blue one doesn't have any correction, your phones don't hook into any of that terrestrial equipment and functionalities that are out there, that's actually a reflection of the distortion that's in the atmosphere. So that median landscaping effort, the oval didn't close and it's canted off by several feet. And you got that drain over on the left-hand side that's 60 feet off on the roof of a building. That's the type of results that happen when you use a phone, because it's not able to tie into any of that high-level structure that I talked about in the earlier slides. And the reason it's not, of course, is because our little teeny phones that are about the size of a typing of a key on a keyboard are optimized to be small and low cost, because we want them in our phones. And if we had to put the GPS structure that we have for high accuracy into our phones, they would suddenly cost a whole lot more money and be bigger. So our GPS chips, GPS is actually accurate for most of them. Lots of them don't listen to the full constellation of those many satellites that are up there. So they are right off the bat, they're listening to, I see BJ just said there are, what was it, 103 base stations, he said? So it's a little bit more than one per county, like we said. So the little chips in our phones oftentimes only listen to GPS. So now you're back to, instead of having 20 satellites to listen to, you're back to that 6 or 7 maybe. And we'll talk again a little bit more why that's even a little bit of a problem. And they don't have any correction going on. So they can be that 15 to 60 feet off. And that's just because of what's happening to the signal in the atmosphere as it comes from the satellites to our phones. Somebody actually did a study of how much that inaccuracy is. And one of the things that they did with GPSs on phones and tablets in the early days when they first came out was turn on a thing sometimes called AGPS or assisted. And they said, well, my phone, the little chip that I've got in my phone can get its signals blocked pretty easily, so that you end up not even getting any result. And so they programmed in the development phases for the phones, augmentation that says, if my phone can't find out where I am from the GPS, listen to the nearby Wi-Fi stations, because Wi-Fi routers all have a little bit of a piece of information in their actual MAC addresses or IP addresses that says where they're physically located. But obviously Wi-Fi routers are spaced around in buildings at widely variable levels of density. So an average assisted GPS unit, if you've gotten your phone into a place where it can't see the sky, is jumping from 8 meters by itself to 74 meters. And if you're out in the boonies or there's no Wi-Fi around and it uses the nearby cell towers where you're getting your data from, it jumps out to 600 meters. So this is another reason why if you can't tell with your phone whether it's trying to help get a result by triangulating less accurate location information in. So that kind of explains why your phones, you can do better lots of times mapping on your phone with your finger than you can with your GPS, because that's what's happening on the chip on a GPS. It works great for having your car drive you from one address to another, but it doesn't on its own. The GPS in consumer devices are going to be doing those types of behaviors that are going to prevent you having any sense of repeatable, reliable location results. And they always have GPSs of any kind have to optimally work in open conditions. The signals are coming from above us in the sky. If your receiver is not got a clear view of the sky, it's not going to get quality signals from the GPSs. And if you think back to what I said about before 2012 and the GPS only constellation, that's one of the things that used to be a obstacle for people using GPS, was when you get out there and you're close to the north side of a building. Most of the satellites above us at this latitude in North America spend most of their orbital time physically south of us. They do go overhead, but most of the time at any one moment when you go outside, most of the satellites are going to be south of you. So if you're right next to a north side of a building, you often get a much more distorted signal because you've lost the ability to actually read satellites that are south of you. Same thing happens to your satellite radio when you're in your car and you park right next to the north side of a building. You can lose your satellite radio signal. Same thing is true there. So anytime you read a spec on a piece of hardware from a GPS dealer like me, it's going to have been spec'd under open sky conditions. And tree canopy is another thing that people know can affect your GPS quality. And so lots of times people do try to do some of their GPS data collection in leaf off times of the year. If you think about it though, with all those extra satellites that are up there these days, it's a lot. If there's 26 satellites to choose from, it's usually pretty easy to get that minimum of 4 that you need. And you can oftentimes when you look at the equipment that I help provide people with, the specifications in the device will tell you that it's tracking 20 to 24 satellites and using 11 to 14 of them. So since 2012, with the advent of multi-constellation and more space vehicles up there above us, the problem of having a blocked sky has become much less of a problem. It's always going to be something that you do need to think about, but in the days, before 2012, when it stopped you from being able to map, these days it's almost a moot point because these receivers can see satellites because there's just so many more to choose from. There's another small source of error that professional devices will take care of that a consumer device wouldn't, and it's called multipath. It's just like what it sounds like. This electromagnetic energy is coming down from the satellites in multi-directional, unidirectional. And so if a signal happens to bounce off a reflective piece of glass on a building, and then that reflected signal hits your receiver, the device will have gotten this exact same signal information from a one satellite at 2 different times. And that's called multipath because that's going to help. That's not going to help get the accurate result you want. This will degrade the potential signal. I know specifically in the Trimble devices that I'm familiar with, the under the hood workings of, they have it's known that the signals are polarized, and so one of the things that a professional device will often do will be just have a polarized filter, so that if something's been reflected once, it'll just get rejected because it's coming in at the wrong polarization angle. It's coming from the right and it needs to be from the left, or vice versa. So phones will never do that, but a piece of professional equipment will have multipath processing, and it'll have extra shielding on the device when those antennas that are larger on the GPS units that look like a little parabolic disc. One of the things that parabolic disc is doing is blocking multipath. Think about those microphones that the guys use on the sidelines of a football game or something. The little parabolic dish lets them aim their microphone and hear the guys out on the field, and it shields all the noise from the crowd coming from the sides. Same thing on professional GPS units. There's going to be some multipath shielding. So when you're working out in the real world, it's reducing as much as it can the multipath potential for error. That's not as big of a problem as the actual atmospheric distortion that happens, but it's another piece that a Trimble unit would do for you, for instance. So we're talking about what people are using in their hands, and let's talk a little bit about what the professional pro options are these days. And you can see many of them are involving something that looks like a nice new iPhone or Android device, but some of them still are the traditional ones that some of you may have been familiar with and have been around for 10 or 15 years. So I'll get into that in a little bit more. But like I said, the takeaway on the actual function here is for repeatable, reliable, professional mapping, you do need a professional piece of GPS hardware or software. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Are there any more questions after the segment 3 there? Nope. Okay. So you saw my slide before the question there. Things have come quite a long way. Since 1977 was when they first were able to get a commercial signal from the GPS signals in the civilian sector, and that's what the GPS looked like. It was actually done right there in Iowa, Rockwell Collins and Cedar Rapids. 6 feet tall, 700 pounds, and 2 people had to sit and operate it. So we went from that to that little chip that we saw on our phones. So things have come a long way. And the state of the practice today, if you want to be able to get that results that I was talking about, are you using a smart device of some kind, can be a tablet or a phone, and Bluetooth connecting to a piece of equipment. This happens to be called an R1 as a Trimble device, and it's a sub-meter accurate device. And it does the connection and the calculations and the math that, like I've described to this point, and then broadcasts its result by Bluetooth. So all of the multipath and correction source, etc., and listening to the GPS is happening on this device. This is the little antenna, and inside there is the ability to connect to and use both the navigational signals coming from the sky and a correction source that you configure, and then its results will be picked up by a Bluetooth smart device. The traditional way of doing things before the smart devices were so prevalent, so 5 to 10 years ago, this is the GPS under the hood of what's a traditional, what's called a geo. And it actually has a Microsoft Windows embedded handheld mobile operating system and specialized software. And so up until about 6 years ago when Collector first came out, your professional piece of equipment was doing all of those extra things under the hood that you needed to get high accuracy GPS, but it was also a specialized data collector. And so you needed to be pretty trained. Most times it was GPS, it was GIS trained people that were doing the mapping, and the software routines were a little more complicated. If you ever used ArcPad, you had to do check-ins and check-outs. And there was only one unit typically. So if you needed to do GPS, you needed to have the GPS, and all of the data management happened on the back end. These days, if you want to do mapping and using high accuracy GPS, you got an easy to use app like Collector. The software is up in the cloud and the data is hosted on the cloud. And so everybody has a data collector in their hand. They can use what they need to. And then if you need to get the higher accuracy, the GPS units are just Bluetooth pairing, and so you can share the high accuracy with more than one data collection device. It's not tethered to a piece of equipment that you can't have everybody use. That connection for the GPS is typically done by just a downloadable free app that there's where you put together the instructions in simple configuration settings that tell that phone or tablet that you have in your hand, please don't listen to the little chip that I've got. I want you to go to this COM port and listen to this Bluetooth stream. And inside of the application is where you will have set up a correction source, like this one shows SBAS. So this was an R1 connected to the SBAS for sub-meter accuracy in a courtyard somewhere in Milwaukee, I think this happens to be. But so you do a one-time configuration, and then any app on that smart device that's looking for GPS information can get that professional high accuracy from a connected device and be working at sub-meter accuracy. So I think at 40 minutes, I've gone through my spiel And if I did a good job, I mean, I won't have any questions, but I'm still ready to field any questions if anyone wants to know more. Well, I think, like I said, I wasn't sure I was gonna use the entire time, but half an hour, 40 minutes was good for a lunch. And you know how to get a hold of me and Siler across Iowa. We cover the whole state. And anybody who has any geo questions about GNSS technology can always call and ask us their friendly local Siler person for more information or help.
Hi, Gail.
Gail, there are a couple questions coming in.
Okay, so
Go ahead, Josh. That's what I was going to do, is read the questions.
okay, I'm ready.
Go ahead, Micah.
So somebody asked, is how much little wind does the wind affect GPS signals?
Nope, wind does not appreciably affect GPS. Think about it. It's electromagnetic. It's just a certain frequency, so it's much like a radio signal. It's an analog electromagnetic signal that is not truly affected by wind. The reason why the atmosphere is a distortion is because the actual particles are ionized particles. So solar flares and things that can create, and aurora borealis and those things that can create ionization in the atmosphere, that's what physically bounces around an electromagnetic signal. But rain or wind do not. Obviously, lightning can, because you're dealing with electricity in the atmosphere again. And high voltage electrical lines can also sometimes have an effect, but it really needs to be something that's going to have some effect on the electromagnetic energy field.
There was another question. Adam was asking, are there any specific non-GPS constellation limitations that are implemented by foreign-owned operators which limit our use of these constellations?
Good question. I'm not sure off the top of my head. For those of you who know a little bit about the history of GPS, even though the constellation had its first 18 satellites and was operational in 1986. And it is a military. And so up until, I think it was Bill Clinton that signed it, they were worried about the type of things that might happen if someone were to start spoofing or fiddling with the GPS signals for the military operations. And so they had a thing that was called selective availability. And then what they did was they literally scrambled the signals for civilian frequencies so that you'd never know when it was on or off. So you didn't know whether you could trust it, essentially. And they literally had that on until the Bill Clinton administration. He was the one. It became apparent that it was such an intrinsic infrastructure service that they needed to let people start using it. And people don't always know this. It's so embedded in our regular day-to-day life now that financial transaction institutions have GPS use the atomic clocks that are on the GPS satellites now for universal global timestamps. So it's very much incorporated into our everyday lives. And it would not surprise me as the countries that didn't start out with GPS came online, they did have something like that to try to figure out. They're going to have their own security protocols. I don't know of anything right now, because GLONASS came online first, and Russia and the United States were always in the Cold War, and we've been using GLONASS ever since it came online. So it's possible, but don't know.
Excellent. So then there was another question, Gail. The handheld Bluetooth Connect device, your receiver, can it assist tethered phones when the phones are operating under cover? For example, if you have your Bluetooth device with access to the constellation, etc., can the phone without access to the constellation operate with the position? Oh my gosh, this may be too big of a call. Keith, Do you have access to microphone, dude? I think you're going to have to ask your own question because I got confused just reading it.
Yeah, what is that device called that you said was Bluetooth connected to the phones?
A receiver? Like a Bluetooth
Receiver.
receiver?
It's
Yeah.
a GPS receiver. Yep. Let me go back to a picture of a couple of them. So,
I don't want to watch
this-
it.
so in this picture, this one happens to be called a Catalyst, and that runs on Android, and it's actually just an antenna, and the Android does the calculations. The one in the lower, this corner over here is a traditional one with running a data collector on Windows Embedded Handheld. This one here is a Zephyr antenna that's just connected to, that's also connected to Windows Embedded Handheld. And when you have a receiver like this, an antenna like this is going to be a much more sensitive antenna than what's also inside the actual consumer device. Same thing here. These are going to be of similar accuracy. It's about the size of a planter can of peanuts. And there's a parabolic dish there for the multipathing, and the receiver is calculating and broadcasting results by Bluetooth. It has a single button. So the only thing that when you get the Bluetooth connected ones, the receiver itself is doing the high accuracy GPS location, and the connection by Bluetooth is controlled by whatever you've got it configured to use. So you can get different they go up by cost as you get into the dual frequency and higher specifications. So the R1, that's about the size of a deck of cards, that's a sub-meter device. The R2, like in the picture of the woman here with the blue sweatshirt, that's probably a sub-meter device. And so it's going to have slightly different configuration when you set it up to talk to a mapping app like Collector. But yes, the device will work at spec the same as they have for 20 years. Under tree canopy, it's going to be not necessarily as quickly accurate as out in the open sky, but ultimately the answer is yes. The Bluetooth devices work at a professional spec that is that is published for those devices, and it should work at that level of accuracy until you get into a too much of an obstructed sky. But these days, when you're able to easily pick up more than 20 satellite signals and choose the best 10, you're going to have just fine results under tree canopy in most cases.
I guess I need to back up. The gal who mentioned this earlier was right. It's a poorly worded question. I guess the applications that I'm looking to solve are if you're going to survey underground in underground mining operations, or let's say in an airport or something like that, where you don't have great GPS signal or something like that. Is there a relay station or some method to work off of any of those devices, any of those receivers?
In the actual, when you're talking about underground operations, and Trimble has in our survey much more focused survey product line, they definitely help people with mining operations all the time. What you're going to typically have is some sort of control points that are of known location at the ingress and egress points to this tunneled location. And they're going to put targets or something down, and they're going to do traditional survey with those control points as the ability to get you georeferenced. And I know that currently, and then they'll use sub-centimeter accuracy survey total station type measurements that are working in 3 dimensions, but they'll tie in to and they may use a GPS location for the target control point. And the data project as a whole will georeference by virtue of those control points. And they'll have specifications on how many control points they need spaced at what point to be able to have a verifiable delivered accuracy. But underground, you don't typically directly use a GPS signal. You can tie into accessible GPS signals using LiDAR or traditional total stations. But so the answer is, traditional workflows can capture those things and tie into a GPS located control, but that won't work directly with an fully obstructed sky. GPS does not work directly indoors or underground.
Nor any relays. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Anyone else have a question they want to ask Gail while we've got her? No. This is Micah Cutler, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us today for the Lunch and Learn. This is going to be an ongoing series that we're going to try and do once a month. And next month, we're going to be scheduling, the topic is going to be using Slack. And so some people, we've got most of the board have joined the IGIC Slack, and I'm going to be sending out a link to the entire IGIC user list probably tomorrow, maybe later today, I'm not sure, sometime in the next day or so, and inviting people to join. And so there'll be an opportunity to kind of use it and play around. Hey, Matt Boyk, are you on still? I might be reaching out to you for some assistance. Just a heads up. I'm putting together some topics to discuss Slack. Awesome. And then we've got some topics scheduled in January. So look for the emails and the links. Somebody pointed out, and I appreciate that until I think this morning, everything I had done had kind of been Outlook centric in terms of the downloadable event that had all the WebEx information. And that's handy for those of us who use Outlook, but I'll make sure that we get the link sent in a way that works for everybody. So it's not just for people who use Outlook for their email. BJ, Josh, anyone else have anything they want to discuss?
I just want to thank Gail again for a wonderful presentation. I'm glad I don't have to go after this.
Well, it was fun. Thanks for inviting me. And we're always here for resources. We're geo geeks and love to talk geo anything. So if you have a geospatial question, look us up.
Well, thanks again. It was truly excellent.
And she's not kidding. I've used Gail for some of my work stuff, and she knows her stuff and has really been helpful in getting our equipment working. So thanks again, Gail.
You bet. And you don't have to go to the highest level. You can start out with stuff that's the size of a manhole cover and get better after that. But there's plenty of easy and affordable ways to get using high accuracy GPS these days. It's very much more flexible than it was even 5 years ago.
Agreed.
And this was recorded, so we'll be putting out the link of the recording at some point once it's finished. Whatever it does behind the scenes.
Once it's finished processing and you can upload it.
Yeah.
Well, everybody have a great GIS day.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye.